The city stretched out below him like a circuit board lit in gold and silver. But from the 5th to 7th floor, it all looked strangely lifeless. David Langford stood in front of the wall of glass, his reflection staring back at him in the darkness of the penthouse window. The world called him a visionary, a titan, a man who had bent technology into his will and built an empire strong enough to shift markets. With a single word, at 48, he lived the life he once promised himself as a boy he would one day claim private jets waiting on runways, magazine covers naming him the architect of tomorrow, senators and kings shaking his hand with reverence, power. It had been his obsession, his armor, his way of never being that powerless boy again. That boy was still there, hidden beneath the Italian suits and polished silver hair. A boy who remembered the smell of stale cigarettes and overdue bills in a cramped apartment. A boy whose mother worked 2 jobs and still came home bone-tired, while his father had walked out without a word. He had sworn then that he would never live at the mercy of anyone. Money, success, control. He would take it all until nothing could touch him, and he had done it. He had built his fortress of glass and steel, towering above the city. Only now, standing here, he felt the weight of that vow like a chain around his neck. The penthouse was quiet to quiet. Lights flickered on with motion sensors as he moved through the vast kitchen. Sleek countertops reflecting the glow of the city. No smell of dinner waiting. No laughter bouncing off the walls. Just the hum of smart appliances and the occasional buzz of his calendar reminding him of tomorrow's meetings. He reached for a glass, poured a measure of scotch, and sat in silence. The sound of the ice against crystal far louder than it should have been. He had everything, but there was one thing he did not have, and it gnawed at him most in the stillness of nights like this. Her name was Emily. Her laugh was the last sound that could still cut through the noise in his head, though he hadn't heard it in years. He remembered the weight of her in his arms on the day she was born, the sterile hospital air. The way her tiny fists curled like she was holding the whole world. For 9 years, she had been his girl. Pancakes every Sunday, long walks in the park. Her small hand clutching his as they named strangers who passed them. "You're my superhero, Daddy," she used to say, eyes shining like she meant it. For a while, he believed her, but superheroes don't vanish, and he had. The silence of the penthouse reminded him of everything he had chosen instead of her meetings. Investors, late-night phone calls in place of bedtime stories. Megan's words still echoed in his mind the night she walked out. "You're married to your empire, not to us." He had told himself then that Emily would hate him anyway, that she'd be better off without him. It was easier than facing her eyes full of questions he couldn't answer. On his 46th birthday, sitting alone on the rooftop garden with a single glass of champagne, he had whispered into the night, "I wonder if she even remembers the pancakes." The words had left his lips like a confession, one no audience would ever hear. Now, 2 years later, he stood in his glass tower, surrounded by proof of his power, yet undone by the absence of a little girl who once called him a superhero. The world believed he had everything, but in the space between applause and silence, David Langford had nothing. Not really, not where it mattered. The storm that had been brewing outside his glass penthouse broke loose the next evening. Rain streaked across the vast windows of his office, distorting the city lights into trembling rivers of gold. David Langford sat at his desk, hunched over, streams of data projected on a holographic screen, but his eyes weren't following the numbers. He was restless, shifting in his chair as if his own skin no longer fit him. Success had taught him how to dominate markets, outthink rivals, silence skeptics. But it hadn't taught him how to stop the quiet war inside his chest that was sharpened when Maya, his assistant, stepped into the room. Maya was unflappable, her presence as sharp as the heels that clicked against marble floors. She rarely hesitated, yet tonight, she paused, clutching her tablet tighter than usual. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her voice unusually soft. David didn't look up from his desk. "Schedule it for next quarter. She won't leave." Maya continued, "She refuses, said you know her." Something in those words prickled at the edges of his mind. He raised his gaze, ice blue eyes narrowing. Did she give a name? No. Maya shifted slightly, her professional calm cracking, but her tone, sir, it wasn't like a reporter or a client. It was personal. David waved a hand, as if dismissing the feeling tightening in his chest. "Security will handle it." But as Maya left, the unease lingered. Hours passed. The office grew quieter, the world beyond his glass walls swallowed by storm. By the time he finally gathered his briefcase, the building was nearly empty. That's when he noticed it, something small and foreign resting just inside his office door. A folded piece of paper. David froze. No one slipped handwritten notes under the door of a man like him. Everything came through encrypted channels, calendars, protocols. His pulse quickened as he stooped to pick it up. The paper was damp at the edges, as though carried through rain. No envelope, just deliberate folds, clean, neat. He hesitated, then unfolded it. The handwriting hit him first. Slanted, feminine, and achingly familiar. His breath caught in his throat. He hadn't seen those loops and sharp crosses in years, not since birthday cards signed with love. Not since doodles left on his office desk by a little girl who loved. Crayons more than pens dot his eyes, scan the words. You once said I'd hate you when I got older. I didn't. I missed you, but I'm not here for me. I'm here for them. The words blurred for a moment as his mind reeled. He read them again, then again. Each letter dragged him deeper into a memory he had tried to bury beneath layers of steel and success. Emily. The paper trembled in his hands. He sat back heavily in his leather chair, staring up at the ceiling as if the answers might be carved there. Them. Who were they? Children. A husband. A family he knew nothing about. His stomach knotted. For years he had convinced himself she was better without him. That staying away had been the merciful thing. Now the note told him she hadn't hated him, she had missed him. The one lifeline he had long believed severed was suddenly pulled. Taut again. He pressed the paper against his chest, his heartbeat thundering beneath it. The silence of the office seemed to mock him. What had she meant by "I'm here for them"? Was she in trouble? Were they in danger? Or was it something far worse, that she had built a life without him? A life he would now never be part of, as she was only here for a final formality. That night, David did not sleep. He paced the penthouse halls, his footsteps echoing through rooms filled with artifacts of wealth, but empty of warmth. He poured drinks and left them untouched. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the folded note as though it might change its meaning if he looked long enough. For the first time in decades, fear crept into his chest, not of markets collapsing or rivals rising, but of something roar, deeper, the fear of facing his daughter again, of realizing what his absence had cost, and of finding out who them were by dawn. His reflection in the glass no longer looked like a titan. It looked like a man who had built his empire on sand. The next morning, he walked into the office early, suit sharp, face composed, though inside a storm still churned. When Maya greeted him, he interrupted her with a single command. If that woman comes back, let her in. No questions. No appointment. Maya hesitated, eyes narrowing slightly, then nodded. Understood. David turned toward the vast window. The city bustling unaware below, yet inside. A storm surged louder than any applause he'd ever received. Something was coming. Something he couldn't calculate. Something he could no longer ignore. The elevator ride down felt like the longest descent of his life. Each floor that blinked past might as well have been a year of silence. A year of absence between himself and the girl he once carried on his shoulders, his hand tightened against the polished rail, slick with sweat despite the immaculate cool of the air-conditioned shaft. By the time the doors slid open with their gentle chime, David Langford's heart was pounding like a drum inside his chest. The lobby of the tower was designed to impress: soaring ceilings, glass walls, marble floors that gleamed under warm golden light. Normally, it was a place where clients admired his empire before ever meeting the man himself. But tonight, as his eyes scanned the space, the grand lobby transformed into an arena of dread. She was there, Dot, in the far corner, sitting on one of the sleek lounge chairs meant for executives and royalty, was a woman with a cardigan wrapped tightly around her, jeans worn thin at the knees, her hair tied back in a messy bun. She looked tired, weathered, but when she raised her head, David's breath caught. The years had reshaped her, but he knew, every bone in his body knew, Emily. For a moment, he stood frozen, the distance between them heavy with all the unspoken. Years. His throat tightened, the words lodged like stones. He took one step forward, then stopped when he noticed what she was holding. Not one, but two small bundles swaddled in pale blue blankets. Tiny fists peeked out, soft skin the color of morning, their breathing faint but steady. They were asleep, pressed against her chest as if the world outside didn't exist. David's knees nearly gave way. His mind scrambled to make sense of what he was seeing, but his body was already betraying him. His chest caving inward with something sharp and unfamiliar, regret, longing, fear. Emily rose carefully, shifting her weight so as not to disturb the babies when she stood fully. Her eyes, those eyes that once had looked up at him with blind adoration, met his. For an agonizing second, the years disappeared, and he saw the 9-year-old girl with gap teeth and a chocolate milk mustache, laughing as she poured too much whipped cream on her pancakes. But then the years snapped back into place, and all he saw was a woman who had lived without him. "Hi, Dad." Her voice was soft, trembling, but firm enough to cut through the silence. The word Dad landed like a blow. He hadn't heard it in so long. He wasn't sure he was worthy of it anymore. His lips parted, but no sound came out. His hands hung uselessly at his sides. Emily glanced down at the bundle she carried, then lifted her gaze back to his. "These," she whispered, her voice breaking just slightly, "are your grandsons." The words hit him harder than any market. Crash. Harder than the night Megan had walked out. Grandsons. His chest constricted. His world tilted. He stumbled a step closer, as though the floor had shifted beneath him. He looked at the tiny faces tucked into blankets, serene and oblivious to the storm raging above them. His throat tightened until it ached. Grandsons. The word left his mouth barely audible, almost like a prayer. Emily gave a faint, weary smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Noah and Micah. Biblical names, strong, gentle, names chosen with thought, with love, names chosen without him. His mouth opened, then closed. He swallowed hard, the sting in his chest spreading like fire. "I didn't even know you were." His voice cracked. "I didn't know." Her reply was soft, but it cut him down to his bones. "You didn't know anything." She adjusted one of the blankets, her fingers brushing against the downy hair of one twin. Her tone wasn't angry, it was worse. It was factual, final. David's pulse roared in his ears. Every instinct in him screamed to ask questions, to explain, to apologize, to collapse into tears at her feet. But instead, he motioned toward the private conference room just off the lobby. "Please," he managed. "Come inside." She hesitated. The weight of years of abandonment balanced in that pause. Then, without a word, she stepped forward and followed him into the glass and chrome chamber. The twins stirred faintly, little. Sounds like sighs died inside. The silence was suffocating. David sat stiffly across the table, his hands curling into fists to keep them from trembling. Emily lowered herself into a chair, one baby in each arm, her cardigan slipping slightly as she adjusted their blankets. The sterile shine of the room only seemed to magnify the warmth of the infants in her lap. For a moment, neither spoke. The air was thick with ghosts. Then Emily's eyes lifted, steady despite the tremor in her lips. "I didn't come for money," she said, her voice low, her words deliberate. "I came because I had nowhere else to go." The words pierced deeper than any accusation. He had expected rage, resentment, perhaps even hatred. But this quiet truth was worse. It was the sound of someone too tired to hate, too broken to pretend. David swallowed hard, his voice hoarse. "Then tell me," he whispered. "Please, tell me everything." And as Emily began to speak about love, about loss, about the years he had missed, David realized the moment he had always feared had finally arrived. There would be no empire strong enough, no wealth deep enough, to shield him from what he was about to hear. The silence in the glass-walled conference room pressed down heavier than any boardroom battle David Langford had ever faced. He had once stared down senators, investors, even hostile takeovers without breaking stride. But sitting across from his daughter now, his palms slick against the polished chrome table, he felt stripped bare. The empire he had spent decades building meant nothing here. All the stock options, the headlines, the power, it could not shield him from the truth Emily carried in her tired eyes. She adjusted one of the babies against her chest, the motion so natural it cut him with guilt. He had never seen her as a mother before. He hadn't even been there to see her become a woman. She drew in a shaky breath. "You asked me to tell you everything, so I will." Her voice was steady at first, but each word carried weight, as though every memory had been carved in stone. She told him about college, the small victories, the way she had worked 2 jobs just to keep tuition afloat. He should have been there writing checks, clapping at graduations, but he wasn't. She told him about the way she stopped looking at her phone on her birthdays, because every year she hoped his name might appear, and every year it didn't. His chest tightened until it hurt. Then her eyes softened, just for a moment. And then I met Daniel. She spoke his name like a memory wrapped in light. Daniel, a pediatric nurse, young, gentle, with a crooked smile and a love for jazz. He made terrible coffee, danced with her in the kitchen, and promised her a life filled with presence, not just ambition. David felt the sting of comparison instantly. Where he had chosen boardrooms, Daniel had chosen laughter. Where he had chosen empire, Daniel had chosen her. Her face faltered as she continued. We got married at 20, too young, everyone said, but it felt right. She smiled faintly, remembering, then her voice broke, and then she stopped, biting her lip, eyes glistening. David leaned forward, the instinct of a father he hadn't earned climbing through his chest. And then what? Her next words shattered him. 6 months ago, a drunk driver ran a red light. Daniel was gone before the ambulance even arrived. I was 7 months pregnant. The room tilted. David's breath caught. His gaze dropped. To the babies, tiny bundles sleeping unaware in their mother's arms. His grandsons. Daniel's children. Children who would never know their father. Emily blinked fast, trying to steady herself. I thought that was the worst of it, but it wasn't. Her voice cracked on the next words. Mom died a year before that. Ovarian cancer. It spread too fast. 1 minute she was fighting. The next she shook her head, unable to continue. David's mouth opened, then closed. Megan, the woman he once swore to love, the woman who had raised Emily without him, had faced death alone while he had been sipping champagne on private jets. He felt sick. Emily lowered her gaze to the twins. So now it's just me and them. Her voice was fragile, but her arms around the babies were firm, protective, unshakable. David's fist curled against the table. He wanted to say he was sorry, wanted to tell her he would have been there if he had known, but the truth slammed into him. He hadn't been there because he hadn't chosen to be. He had let pride and shame build walls until even tragedy couldn't pierce them. She looked at him then, her eyes burning with years of silence. Do you know how many times I hated you? Her voice wavered. I hated that you didn't fight for me when the divorce happened, that you let Mom walk away without even trying to stop her, that every birthday, every milestone, you left me waiting for someone who never came. David flinched. Her words cut deeper than any corporate betrayal. They were truth, raw and unvarnished. He whispered, I thought I was doing what was best for you. I told myself you'd be better off without me. She shook her head slowly, tears threatening. Well, you were wrong. The words slammed into him, sharp and final. His empire crumbled in that instant. Not the stock markets or the press, but the myth he had told himself for decades, that his absence was mercy. The babies stirred, one letting out a soft whimper. Emily rocked them gently, her strength steady even through her exhaustion. She looked back up at him, voice softer now, yet somehow more powerful than before. But I don't have the luxury of staying mad anymore. Her gaze shifted to Noah and Micah. They need people who love them, who show up, who stay. That's why I'm here. The words hummed between them like thunder. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't begging for forgiveness. She was giving him a choice. Step in or step aside. David's throat tightened. He lowered his gaze to the table, ashamed, shattered. I don't deserve to hold them, he whispered. Emily leaned forward, locking her eyes on his. Her voice steady as a hammer. Then start deserving it. The silence that followed was deafening. For words, nothing more, but they reverberated through him harder than any courtroom verdict or shareholder rebellion. For the first time in his life, David Langford felt powerless. Not because of markets, not because of rivals, because of a daughter's truth, because of 2 tiny lives he had never known existed, who now represented the only thing that could save him from himself. And for the first time in years, he wanted to fight. The conference room's silence felt like it could swallow him whole. The city below hummed with its usual indifference, but here, in this sterile glass box, time seemed to hold its breath. Emily's words, then start deserving it, still, pulsed in his ears like a drumbeat he couldn't escape. He sat there frozen, staring at her, at the babies, at everything he had missed and everything he feared to lose again. Emily shifted, adjusting her bag over her shoulder with the careful grace of someone who had grown used to carrying the world on her back. Her eyes lingered on him only for a moment before she rose from her chair. "It's late," she murmured. "I should take them home." Home, the word hit him like a knife. Not here. Not with him. Somewhere else. Somewhere he didn't belong. His body screamed to move, to say something, to stop her, but his mouth betrayed him. All he managed was a stiff nod, as if he were negotiating another deal instead of facing the collapse of his life. She took the steps toward the door, her grip tightening around the baby's, and that was when it happened. A small whimper, soft at first, then rising into sharp cries. Micah tiny, fragile Micah was unraveling in his mother's arms. His fists flailed, his face reddened, his little mouth opened wider with each cry. Emily rocked him gently, whispering soothing words, but his sobs only grew more frantic, slicing through the air like sirens. David's chest clenched. The sound was unbearable. He had faced markets crashing, journalists circling like vultures, entire governments pressing against him, but nothing had ever torn through him. Like the helpless cries of that child, his grandson. Emily sighed, exhaustion flashing across her face. "He's been colicky all week," she said softly, patting Micah's back. "He hates car rides. Sometimes there's nothing I can do." Her voice cracked with weariness, with the kind of fatigue he couldn't even comprehend. David's body moved before his mind did. He rose from his chair, his hands twitching at his sides, his throat tight. "May I?" Emily blinked, startled. She froze, as if the request itself was a knife through years of silence. "What?" "Let me try," he said, his voice almost breaking. "Can I hold him?" Her eyes searched his face, searching for lies, for weakness, for the selfish man she had grown up without. For one terrifying second, he thought she would say no, that she would clutch Micah tighter, shielding him from the man who had once let her slip away. But then slowly, careful as she shifted, sliding the squirming infant into his arms. David's hands trembled as they closed around Micah. The baby was so small, so light, yet felt heavier than any fortune he had ever carried. He held him awkwardly at first, stiff and uncertain. Micah wailed louder, his cries echoing against the cold glass. David's heart thundered in his chest. "I'm failing him already." Then something inside him broke. He took a breath, steadying his arms, pressing Micah gently against his shoulder. His body swayed, side to side, back and forth, instantly inclined its way through years of absence. He murmured nonsense under his breath, the way he once had when Emily was just as small. Slowly, unbelievably, Micah's cries began to soften. The wailing gave way to hiccup sobs, then to fragile whimpers, then finally to silence. Tiny breaths warmed David's neck as the baby settled against him, trusting him. David's eyes blurred. His throat burned. The tears came unbidden, sliding down his face, dripping onto the pale blue blanket. He stood there in the middle of a room worth more than most people's homes, but for once, nothing in it mattered. Only the small weight in his arms, only the miracle of trust he did not deserve. Emily watched, frozen, her lips parted slightly, her eyes shining. And then she whispered words that cut him deeper than anything else she'd said that night. "He has your eyes." David's breath hitched. He looked down at Micah's tiny sleeping face, and it was true, the same shade of blue, the same shape, softer now, but undeniable. His knees buckled beneath the weight of it. He staggered back into a chair, clutching Micah close as though letting go would shatter him into pieces. "I missed it all," he choked, his voice breaking open. "I missed everything. Your birthdays, your first heartbreak, your wedding, losing Daniel, their birth." His chest heaved. And for what? For headlines, for numbers on a screen, for an empire that feels emptier every time I walk into it. Emily stepped closer, her eyes locked on him. She said nothing, not yet. David's tears fell freely as he looked back up at her. "This," he whispered, rocking Micah gently, "this is what matters. Not power, not markets. This." His voice cracked again. "But I don't deserve this moment. I don't." Emily's silence was heavy, but not cruel. She let him sit in it, let him choke on the truth. He had spent years running from his failures. Now, face to face with his grandson's steady breaths, he could run no longer. And then something shifted. The crying baby had become a sleeping one, and the man who once saw himself as unshakable was trembling like a child. For the first time in decades, David Langford was stripped of his armor. Not a CEO, not a mogul, just a father, just a grandfather. Emily finally spoke, her voice quiet, but steady. I never needed you to be perfect. She stepped closer, placing her hand lightly on his shoulder. I just needed you to show up. David closed his eyes, the words sinking deep, anchoring him to a truth he could no longer ignore. For the first time in his life, he felt ready to fight, not for power, not for wealth, but for them. For her, for the two tiny lives asleep against his chest. And as Micah breathed softly against him, David understood this was his second chance, his only chance, and he could not afford to lose it. The penthouse did not look the same anymore. It wasn't the skyline that had changed San Francisco still glittered outside. Yet its restless brilliance, it was what lay inside the glass fortress. For years, the rooms had been shrines to wealth, cold marble, chrome, leather, and silence. But now there was something foreign here, something fragile, something loud. A baby's cry died at first. David Langford had no idea how to handle it. He had handled billion-dollar mergers with the ease of flipping a switch. He had stared down entire boards of directors without so much as a bead of sweat. But when Noah's cries split the night at 2 in the morning, David found himself standing in the nursery barefoot, hair disheveled, staring at the tiny boy as if confronted by a puzzle too complex even for him. The nursery itself was new. 1 week after that first meeting, he had called a designer. "I want a room ready for them," he'd said curtly when the designer asked if it was for photographs. For the image of family he wanted to present to the press, David's reply had been sharp, "No, a real one that works." He oversaw every detail, crib strong enough to withstand storms, walls painted in soft blues, shelves lined with books he had picked himself. He even remembered Goodnight Moon from Emily's childhood and placed it there, his hand lingering over the pages longer than he expected. But design could not teach him fatherhood or grandfatherhood. The first time he tried to change Micah's diaper, the boy promptly peed on his Armani suit. Maya, his assistant, had walked in on him at that exact moment, her usually impenetrable composure crumbling into stunned laughter. For the first time in decades, David laughed with her, the sound foreign and yet freeing. It was awkward at first. He held the babies like glass. He fumbled with bottles, spilling formula onto his cufflinks. He paced the penthouse halls in the dark, whispering lullabies he half remembered from Emily's toddler years. Yet something strange happened in those fumbling hours. For the first time in decades, the silence inside his home broke. Emily noticed it too. One evening, she walked in and saw him on the floor, in the nursery, tie loosened, hair undone, reading Goodnight Moon with Micah sprawled across his chest. She leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed, her face caught between skepticism and something softer. "I didn't think you'd remember that book," she murmured. David looked up, his voice low. "I don't forget everything." She said nothing, but her lips trembled. The nights stretched into weeks. Slowly, Emily began to stay longer. She had been wary at first, dropping off the boys and watching him like a hawk, waiting for him to prove himself unreliable again. But every time she tested him, leaving him alone for an hour, then two, then overnight, David surprised her. He didn't outsource care to nannies or maids. He didn't hide behind work. He stayed, fumbling and failing, but present. Still, the ghost lingered. One night, after the twins had finally fallen asleep, David sat in the dim glow of the nursery, rocking quietly in the chair. Emily sank into the sofa across the room, exhaustion etched into her face. For a while, they said nothing. The only sound was the soft hum of the city outside. Then, her voice broke the silence. "You know," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, "I'm not looking for a perfect father." David looked at her, waiting. "I just need a real one," she finished, her voice shaking. The words sliced through him. He swallowed, nodding once, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. But his actions began to change. He started leaving the office early, ignoring calls from investors, telling Maya simply, "Cancel it. I have somewhere I need to be." His colleagues whispered about distraction, about weakness. But David didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt stronger when he was rocking a baby to sleep than when he was closing a deal. And yet, suspense hung heavy over every moment. Could he keep this up? Could a man who had once abandoned his own daughter truly transform? Or was this just a fragile illusion that would crumble the next time the world demanded his attention? Emily wondered too. Some nights, when the boys slept, she sat with him on the balcony overlooking the city. The skyline shimmered, but her gaze was fixed on him. "You've always known how to build things," she said once, her voice steady. "Companies, empires, futures, but this." She gestured toward the nursery, the twin soft breaths drifting through the door. "This isn't about building. It's about staying." David met her gaze, and for the first time, he didn't argue. He just nodded, the weight of her words pressing into his bones. The weeks became months. Slowly, Emily began to trust the man who had once been a ghost. And slowly, David began to see that redemption did not arrive in applause or headlines. It arrived in quiet rooms and lullabies, in the steady rhythm of showing up. But even as life began to find its fragile rhythm again, a question still haunted him. Redemption was one thing, legacy was another. Could he give his grandsons more than just his presence? Could he give them a world where they and their mother would never have to feel the kind of abandonment he had inflicted? The answer, he realized, would demand a sacrifice far greater than late nights and nursery feedings. It would demand giving up the one thing he had once thought he couldn't live without, his empire. And the moment to make that choice was closer than either of them knew. The morning headlines should have belonged to him. That always did, for years. David Langford had been the man whose face filled financial magazines, whose words could send markets spiraling or soaring. But on this morning, as he sat in his penthouse, with a steaming cup of black coffee, the world outside seemed oblivious to him. The twins were crawling now tiny, determined explorers. Noah banging a wooden block against the marble floor, while Micah tugged at the leg of his tailored trousers. David didn't mind. In fact, he found himself laughing, truly laughing. The kind of unguarded sound that felt so alien he barely recognized it as his own. Emily sat nearby, sipping tea, watching him with cautious eyes. Months had passed since that first night in the conference room, but some nights she still seemed to wonder if this was all a dream that might vanish by morning. That doubt was not unfounded, because David knew what she didn't. He had been carrying a secret, a decision, one so heavy it threatened to split him in two. The company was everything he had built, his empire, his identity. But the longer he spent cradling Micah during sleepless nights or reading Goodnight Moon to Noah while Emily drifted off on the sofa, the more hollow those towering glass offices began to feel. The board wanted expansion, investors wanted more control, politicians wanted his influence. But he wanted something else. He wanted to stay. The moment of reckoning came one crisp autumn afternoon. His office downtown was packed, journalists crowding the steps, cameras flashing like lightning. The announcement had been teased for weeks. David Langford to unveil major shift for Langford Technologies. Investors buzzed about a merger, a new product, maybe even global expansion. Inside the auditorium, the air thrummed with anticipation. Rows of executives, analysts, and reporters waited as the spotlight hit the stage. David stepped out in his usual flawless suit, silver hair catching the light, his expression cool and unreadable. But this time, his heart wasn't here. He scanned the room, remembering how once this sight, the sea of expectant faces, had fueled him like oxygen. Now it only made him tired of pretending, tired of running. He adjusted the microphone, the silence of the crowd pressing in. For 25 years, he began, his voice steady. I believe legacy was measured in empires, in innovations, in headlines. He paused, his gaze flickering toward the front row where, unknown to most of the crowd, Emily sat quietly with Noah and Micah in her lap. But legacy is measured in something else entirely. The audience shifted, confusion rippling like a wave. David took a breath. Today, I am stepping down as CEO of Langford Technologies. The words cracked the room open. Gasps erupted, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions that overlapped in a frenzy. But David didn't waver. I am leaving not because of scandal, not because of failure, but because I finally remembered what I forgot. Family, love, presence. I lost my daughter once. I will not lose her again. And I will not let my grandsons grow up believing a man is defined by his power instead of his heart. The crowd roared, some with disbelief, some with admiration. The board members looked stunned, betrayed. But David pressed on. I am redirecting my resources into something new. A foundation for single parents, widows, and children families who need someone to stand with them. This foundation will be seeded with everything I once thought would define me, my fortune, because if these past months have taught me anything, it's that no amount of wealth means anything if you come home to silence. The words weren't rehearsed. They were raw, unpolished, but true. And for the first time, David didn't care about how they would be spun in tomorrow's papers. At the back of the stage, the curtain rustled. A staff member rushed forward, whispering urgently. David frowned, but Emily suddenly appeared at the side aisle, Noah squirming in her arms, Micah on her hip. It wasn't planned. She had been waiting backstage, but Noah had begun fussing, and in her exhaustion, she had walked forward. The cameras turned instantly, bulbs flashing. The famously untouchable David Langford froze as his daughter stepped into the light, holding the two boys who had changed his world. For one tense heartbeat, the entire auditorium stood still. Then David crossed the stage, unbuttoning his jacket as though shedding the last layer of his old self. He reached for Micah, who clutched at his collar, and Noah, who pressed his small head against his chest. Emily hesitated, the weight of the world in her eyes. Then aloud the crowd erupted. A storm of applause, questions, flashes, but all of it faded into a blur, because for David, the world had narrowed to this, the steady warmth of the tiny bodies, the tearful gaze of his daughter, and the knowledge that this finally was the only empire worth building. That night, a photo went viral, the once untouchable CEO, laughing in Central Park, toddlers crawling across his lap. The caption read, "The architect of tomorrow built something new, a family." And when asked in an exclusive interview why he gave up everything, David's reply was simple. "I built a company, but I almost lost my family, and no amount of money, no measure of success is worth that. Legacy is not glass towers. Legacy is love that stays." For the first time in his life, David Langford was not running toward power or away from shame. He was simply staying, and in staying, he found everything he had once lost.